Hello, and welcome to our final patient education event this fall. I'm Barbara Goodman, and on behalf of the entire Cures Within Reach team, we're looking forward to this dialogue on diversity of clinical trial researchers as well as patients, followed by a celebration of 3 different organizations' efforts to make an impact on patients through medical repurposing. Cures Within Reach, based in Chicago, leverages the speed, safety, and cost effectiveness of testing already approved therapies in new indications. As the COVID-19 pandemic shown, this spotlight on the fastest way to make an impact in patients is testing already approved therapies through randomized control studies, something the Cures Within Reach has known for over a decade. We are institution agnostic, disease agnostic, and geography agnostic. And in over a decade of funding research, we've provided funds to over 100 projects with over $7 million in funding. And this has helped researchers and projects leverage over $68 million in follow-on funding for these trials. Most of this funding goes to fund what we call seed stage and pivotal proof of concept funding. It's the first in human study that, once successful, provides important catalytic effect for the follow-on larger confirmatory study. We fund clinical trials regardless of commercial value. If there's an opportunity for an industry player to bring it to regulatory approval, or if it's a generic use, philanthropic value. We put patients first, whether they have an opportunity for commercial value or through philanthropic opportunity. We currently have 33 ongoing clinical and preclinical trials in 28 different institutions in 21 diseases across the United States and in 7 other countries. These trials are a mix of adult and patient populations. They're mostly clinical with some preclinical as well. And they include trials in drugs, nutraceuticals, combination products, and more. Within the rare disease space, this is both rare and ultra-rare diseases in neurology, oncology, sight impairment, immune disorders, hearing loss, and others. Within oncology, 24% of our projects are in cancers such as blood cancers, bone cancer, brain cancer, thyroid cancer, and more. Within the neurology space, we fund both mental disorders, mental health issues, as well as neurodegenerative disease, with ongoing projects in PTSD, depression, neurotrauma, Huntington's disease, cerebral palsy, among others. In the infectious disease space, we not only have funded projects in COVID-19 in the United States, but we have an ongoing trial in dengue in South America and in tuberculosis in Africa as well. And we're not resting there. We have 7 clinical and preclinical projects that are pending final site signing. These are in pediatric rare diseases, in veterans issues such as PTSD and traumatic brain injury, in ovarian oncology, and 2 in Meniere's disease. And most exciting for this audience today and in this topic is our diversity, equity, and inclusion community. Later this year, in the next several weeks, we're going to be selecting 10 clinical trials to get started, 3 or so from Chicago's Health Disparities Impact. We're selecting in any disease area, in any US location, led by an underrepresented minority, racial or ethnic minority PI. And finally, we'll be selecting 3 or 4 projects based in low and lower middle income countries in any disease area, all by the end of the year within our diversity, equity, and inclusion space. Today, we are so grateful for our industry partnerships shown here, especially with funding coming from Takeda and its Center for Health Equity, who is supporting our work in underrepresented researchers based in the US and underserved researchers in low and lower middle income countries. We're also grateful for our philanthropic partners shown on this slide, especially with funding from the Searle Funds at the Chicago Community Trust, who's leading our effort to make an impact in Chicago's and communities of color with our health disparities trials. We're also thankful to our disease and patient group partners who have helped spread the word to patients and caregivers wherever they may be, that are shown here to spread the word about this event. With that, it's time to get the main event started. I'm going to hand it over to Claire Thibodeau, who's going to introduce the panel and talk about the program today.
Thanks, Barbara, and thanks to everybody who's attending and to our panelists. They have some great insight that they'll share with everybody in just a little bit. So we have a fantastic program. We're going to start with a short showcase of some of our current trials in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. From there, we'll move on to our panel, and we will be fielding questions from the attendees. So please submit your questions at any time during the program through the engagement panel located on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll share that with our panelists. The last portion of the program will focus on our Global Health Repurposing Awards, where we'll be recognizing leaders in industry, philanthropy, and research who have made a patient impact through repurposing research. So let's get started. As you see on this slide, our first showcase presenter that we'll share with you is Dr. Tysel Phillips at the University of Michigan. Dr. Phillips was a finalist at our 2020 Cure Accelerator Live for Rare Diseases event. And he was actually the first runner-up. He pitched his project for repurposing in mantle cell lymphoma. And although Dr. Phillips did not win, we were pleased to approve his project for funding shortly after the event. So I'm going to let Dr. Phillips now talk to you about his research.
Hi, my name is Dr. Tysel Phillips. I'm an associate professor at the University of Michigan. And I'm here to discuss sort of my journey in clinical research briefly. So I became interested in clinical research, mainly watching family members deal and go through treatment for cancer. Got me very interested in trying to find other ways to manage cancer with the hopes of reducing toxicities. As I went through medical training, I saw that this was accomplished through clinical research. And as such, I directed and motivated myself sort of research venture. I'm currently mainly focused on the research of lymphoid malignancies, which was not ideally my first choice when I went into fellowship, but it was something that I was attracted to based on the intricacies of the cancer itself and a lot of the treatment modalities that were available at the time I underwent my residency. Because of that, I've become an investigator in that sort of treatment at this current time. I feel that it's very important to have, great inclusion in our clinical trials, just because obviously, as we know, we live in a multi-ethnic world where there are very different variations in how we look, and mainly and sometimes in how we metabolize certain drugs and how we respond to certain medications. And in order to get a general sense about how most people will respond to certain treatments and if outcomes are different in certain populations, I think it's important to be very inclusive, as well as to offer some novel treatments to patients who normally wouldn't have that. I mean, a lot of clinical trials nowadays offer treatments that we know have improved efficacy and safety over what we can offer as far as standard of care. So it's very important to be able to include these sort of treatments and what we can give patients, irrespective of their income or ethnic background. My current funded project through CWRS is mainly focused on utilization of some oral medications in a very rare form of lymphoma. The hope is with these medications, given how they're given by mouth, that they have a better safety profile than some of the medications we can give intravenously, and will allow us to sort of provide effective treatment to a greater scope of patients, irrespective of age and or fitness. So with the research funding being provided, it has allowed me to enhance what I feel is a very exciting project and add additional testing for me to better get a sense of how patients respond to this type of treatment and how durable the responses will be, as this is a very important endpoint for the type of treatment we're aiming to sort of hopefully cure one day, but at least in this project of keeping to a remission state for a very long period of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips. We're thrilled to add your work to our DEI community. Next, we'll hear from Dr. David Meltzer at the University of Chicago. Dr. Meltzer's clinical trial examining the ability of vitamin D to prevent COVID-19 infection in Chicago's communities of color is our first Health Disparities project and certainly won't be our last. Dr. Meltzer has been getting a lot of attention for his work and has been featured in the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, on public radio, and on Chicago and national television. Let's hear about Dr. Meltzer's work now.
Hello, my name is David Meltzer, and I'm a physician and economist on the faculty at the University of Chicago, where I'm chief of our section of hospital medicine. My research is on improving care for medically and socially vulnerable individuals. We're located on the south side of Chicago, where we care for a large and otherwise underserved population. My Cures Within Reach project examines whether vitamin D can decrease the risk of catching COVID-19. I got interested in this question early in the pandemic when I read an article that showed that vitamin D supplementation can decrease the risk of viral respiratory tract infections, and I wondered whether this might carry over to COVID-19. I realized that we had patients in our electronic health records at the university who had historical vitamin D records, and that these patients were getting tested for COVID. We reviewed these records and discovered that vitamin D deficient individuals were almost twice as likely to test positive for COVID-19 as people who were not vitamin D deficient. In our analysis, we discovered this was especially true for African American individuals who are known to have a higher risk of vitamin D deficiency and may also be more sensitive than others to levels of vitamin D. This association didn't prove causation. In other words, it didn't tell us for sure that vitamin D supplementation would decrease the risk of COVID-19. So we knew it was important to do clinical trials. We were very fortunate to get funding from Cures Within Reach to help us start our work. And we've also now been able as well to get funding from the National Institutes of Health to continue our clinical trials. We're so grateful for the support of Cures Within Reach in helping us start our work and look forward to being able to report results in the near future. Thanks so much.
Finally, we'll hear from Dr. Manga Hamaluba, who's based in Kenya. Dr. Hamaluba is one of our inaugural ReGrow grant recipients, and ReGrow is our funding program providing grants to researchers based in low and lower middle income countries. Dr. Hamaluba's work focuses on snakebite, which the WHO classifies as a neglected public health issue. In fact, over 5 million people worldwide are affected by snakebite every year. We're proud to be supporting this important work. Dr. Hamaluba, take it away.
Hi, my name is Manga Hamaluba and I'm a pediatrician. I first became interested in clinical research about 3 years into training as a pediatrician. I was working in the UK at the time, but I had an interest to come back and work in Africa, and also I was starkly aware of the discrepancies in the care that I saw on the continent compared to in the UK where I was working. So I started working on different projects such as newborn care and over time in vaccines, and I really latched on to mentors who worked in that space and had a parallel career where I was training to be a doctor, but also trying to find an avenue where I could improve research, particularly in Africa where I had grown up. So I think from my point of view, that fits in well with the diversity, equity and inclusion that we see in the Cures Within Reach programs. And what that means to me is really diversity in projects, diversity in principal investigators who conduct research, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of sex, and having some equity across those areas. So really being able to attract researchers who are women, who are of ethnic minorities, and who might be underrepresented in the research global scheme. So the DEI principal investigators are really important from that point of view. They also allow a richness in the research we do. So it's very easy to fall into conducting research that's heavily funded and very visible on a global scale, but underserved research such as snakebite, which is what I'm also working on, then is less attractive to those particular groups, i.e. Those who might be included in the DEI category. So I think my project, really just telling a little bit about my project. So we're looking at particularly trying to improve the outcomes of people who are bitten by snakes. And this is particularly young children. There are about 80,000 deaths that happen globally each year. And we're trying to find ways to improve treatment to particularly children and also improve outcomes in terms of any disability they might have following a venomous bite. And we're using a drug called unithiol, and that particular drug has been used for heavy metal poisoning, and we know that actually it binds to some of the venom that snakes emit when they bite. So what we're looking to find is the appropriate dose, either as an oral agent or as an IV agent, so that if children in rural settings are bitten, then they're able to take a drug orally, for example, while they seek further health care in a hospital, or if they come to hospital, they get some intravenous therapy that works. There are some other treatments that are available, but basically they're very costly, they're hard to find, and they're not appropriate for the setting we work in. They're manufactured, for example, in India, catering for snakes that are more common in that area. And finally, I guess I'll just tell you a little bit about what this project has meant for the population that we serve in the workspace of snakebite. Essentially, we're now working with community members, trying to get a patient advisory group that can actually feed into what research we do as part of our next steps. So engaging the local community to try and understand what they think of our research, what they think we need to prioritize in the area of snakebite, to help us plan what other work we can do in this under-researched space.
Wonderful. I hope everyone enjoyed that brief showcase of our current, some of our current DEI clinical trials. And Cures Within Reach is really looking forward to adding to our DEI community in the coming weeks and months, as Barbara mentioned. Now, on to our main event. We have a great panel assembled for you here today, and we are honored to be joined as our moderator by Sharday Arojo, the Associate Commissioner for Minority Health and the Director of the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity from the US FDA. Joining Sharday on the panel, we have Lachelle Robinson from Takeda Pharmaceuticals, Kareem Watson from the All of Us Research Program at the NIH, and Regina Greer-Smith from Health Research Associates. Once again, I want to remind everybody, as you are thinking of your questions for the panelists, please submit them via the engagement panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Okay, with that, Sharday, why don't you start us off?
Thank you so much, Claire. It is truly a pleasure to be able to participate in this very important discussion. And thanks so much to Cures Within Reach for the opportunity to participate. Today, I hope to highlight for you the work that FDA has continued to do to advance diversity in clinical trials, and also highlight some of the specific efforts of the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity. Next slide, please. Next slide. By way of background, the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity works to protect and promote the health of racial and ethnic minority, underrepresented, and underserved populations. And we do this by focusing our efforts on research and outreach and communication that works towards addressing health disparities. Next slide, please. Our office is within the Office of the Commissioner at FDA, and we work broadly across our agency as well as with both public and private sector stakeholders. And as I mentioned, we focus our efforts in two key areas. Our research and collaboration program aims to advance minority health and health equity focused research. And we do this by supporting both intramural as well as extramural research. We participate in a range of research activities as well as supporting internships and fellowships. We also have broad stakeholder engagement to advance our research agenda. Our outreach and communication program aims to improve FDA's communications with the populations that we serve. And we do this through a variety of culturally and linguistically tailored programs, initiatives, and campaigns. And of course, one of our most notable initiatives is our Diversity in Clinical Trials initiative. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment. We also have our language access program, and this is a really important program for our office because we work to ensure across all of our tools and resources that we are providing these in multiple languages. We develop health education materials, engage in social media outreach. We have a range of other activities. But one of the areas I want to highlight that's really most important and critical for our office is collaborations and partnerships. We know we can't do this work alone, so collaborations and partnerships are critical for us to achieve our mission. Next slide, please. FDA has long worked to advance diverse participation in clinical trials, from hosting public meetings, developing tools, as well as issuing guidance documents. And you see some of those guidance documents listed here, but the one that I want to focus on is our most recent guidance document that was issued in November 2020. And this was focused on enhancing the diversity of clinical trial populations, eligibility criteria, enrollment practices, and trial designs. And this was a really important guidance for our agency. It provides the agency's current thinking on steps to broaden eligibility criteria, but it also provides recommendations for how sponsors can increase enrollment of underrepresented populations in their clinical trials to improve trial recruitment so that participants enrolled in trials will better reflect the population most likely to use the product. Next slide, please. So to support FDA's efforts to advance diversity in clinical trials, as I mentioned, our office developed our Diversity in Clinical Trials initiative, and this includes an ongoing multimedia public education and outreach campaign that really works to raise awareness around the importance of racial and ethnic minority and other underrepresented population participation in clinical trials. Our campaign aims to combat myths, educate consumers about key issues. We work to provide positive messaging reflecting diverse spokespersons who are representative of diverse communities. And that's really a critical component of this campaign. We also aim to stimulate dialogue among peers and peer-to-provider groups while tailoring our resources to be culturally and linguistically appropriate and translated into multiple languages. Our campaign also includes public service announcements. We've had public meetings and webinars. We have videos, podcasts, both print and digital, health education materials. We have a wide range of social media outreach, a dedicated website, and a communications toolkit. And of course, a key component to this campaign is broad stakeholder engagement with listening sessions, and we are constantly working to add new tools and resources. Next slide, please. This is an example of some of the resources that we have available, just snapshots from some of our videos. Next slide, please. And this is an example of some of our social media outreach. And what we think is most important with our social media outreach is not only to provide different key themes and messages about the importance of diverse participation, but also to link back to where you can find additional information. Next slide. And this is an example of some of those resources. We have our clinical trial diversity fact sheet, brochure, infographic, as well as our dedicated website that houses all of these tools and resources. Next slide, please. And I did want to take a moment to highlight that we also have a wide range of other health education materials, but across all of these materials, we make sure that there is a section where you can link to find additional information about clinical trials. Next slide, please. Of course, we all know that broad stakeholder engagement is critical. We know that advancing diversity in clinical trials is a multifactorial issue, so we work to engage as broadly as possible. Next slide. And an example of how we have engaged, and this was one of our most recent engagement activities where we actually developed a campaign from the engagement. And this was a campaign that we have launched in collaboration with the HHS Office of Minority Health called Let's Take Charge to help make lupus research more diverse. And in developing this campaign, we had a wide range of activities, including patient and caregiver listening sessions to inform our efforts. And I'm really excited to share that and some of our tools and resources and the videos that we have available as part of this campaign, it features patients that participated in those listening sessions. Next slide, please. Another area that we think is very important, and it's of course consistent with the theme for today's meeting, is really working to make sure that we're engaging community providers in research. We know that there have been many strategies that have been developed to increase enrollment of diverse populations. And one strategy that we think is really important is engaging community providers in clinical research and incorporating these providers into the research infrastructure in a sustainable way that unites clinical research with clinical care. And this was a recent publication that we had really highlighting this. Next slide, please. And I definitely wanted to share some data. We all like data and numbers. And one of those that we have that came out from our drug trial snapshots program at FDA. This is a program that is led by FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. And the drug trial snapshots provides consumers with information about those that participated in clinical trials that supported FDA approval of new molecular entities or original biologics. And from the snapshot program, they released their 5-year summary and analysis of clinical trial participation and demographics. And what I want to highlight here, especially from a US clinical trial site perspective and looking at it across racial and ethnic populations, we saw that we had about 15% participation that was Hispanic or Latino. We also found that we had about 16% representation from Black or African Americans, about 2% Asian, about 1% American Indian or Alaska Native, and about 3% were other. Next slide, please. And another area that we, of course, pay close attention to is also trying to understand how that participation looks across therapeutic areas. And we recently published a look at this, again, looking at the 5-year data that I just presented across therapeutic areas. And what we found was that the highest participation of Hispanics or Latinos was in infectious diseases and gastroenterology. And looking at it from the perspective of Black or African American populations, we saw the highest participation was in infectious diseases and psychiatry. For Asians, the highest was in dermatology and oncology and hematology. And then across American Indian or Alaska Native populations, we saw that the highest participation was within infectious diseases and dermatology. And the one area that I'll highlight is our snapshots program is, of course, dependent upon those products that are approved within a year. So it's going to be highly variable, but it really gives us an idea and opportunity to look at trends. Next slide, please. I have highlighted a lot of our outreach and communication efforts, but of course, across our research program, this is also a priority. For example, one of our research projects is in collaboration with the Hepatitis B Foundation, and we're working to continue to understand barriers and challenges to participation across diverse populations in hepatitis B clinical trials. We also, as I mentioned, have hosted workshops, and one of our most recent workshops was focused on collaborating to advance health equity for diabetes and chronic kidney disease. And within that, we had a particular session focused on ways that we can advance enrollment, recruitment, and retention in these trials. Next slide, please. And I just want to close with highlighting our most recent initiative that we've kicked off that's really important for our office. It's an initiative where we are continuing to show our dedication to research projects and communication efforts to enhance equity in clinical trials, equitable data efforts, and equity of voices. And this is across our Enhance Equity initiative. And one area here that I want to mention is, of course, across all of these 3 aims, the equity in clinical trials, we're focused on continuing to advance diversity in clinical trials. Equitable data efforts, we are focused on increasing data on the populations that we serve through funding announcements. We actually have a COVID-19 and health equity funding announcement that's out right now. And of course, equity of voices. It's really important for us to continue to amplify FDA's communications with our diverse consumers, patients, and stakeholders, as well as making sure that we continue to understand diverse patient perspectives, preferences, and unmet needs to inform our efforts. Next slide. Thank you so much for the opportunity to highlight some of our efforts with you today. Our contact information can be found here. And now I'm going to be turning it over to Lachelle Robinson. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So as mentioned, my name is Lachelle Robinson, and I'm the Director of Diversity and Inclusion for Clinical Trials at Takeda Pharmaceuticals. So first, just very, very happy to be here today to, of course, talk about a very, very important topic. And while this has been the hot topic for the last year or so, I think all of us can agree that there has been a lot of research, a lot of ongoing efforts behind the scenes over the last coming years. But this particular conference, we'll talk about different strategies and what we're doing across the industry. When I talk about what Takeda is doing, really what my day-to-day role focuses on is really our strategic fight towards diversity and inclusion. So we're looking to partner with more community stakeholders. Some of those are in the very, very beginnings of those infancies, but some of those are really enriching some of those already existing relationships, especially when we're looking at some of our healthcare providers and those that are really on the external part of the clinical research ecosystem, and how we can better engage them and get them more involved with the clinical research process. We're also taking a step back and looking at those internal barriers and addressing those operational barriers. Obviously, the community outreach and the engagement with the community can really, really help with advancing education, awareness, and access. But we also have to take a look at what we're doing internally to make sure that we're not still having those gaps internally before we start doing that outreach. And I'll get a little bit more into that around what we're doing specifically. And then verifying that our data and any of our goals that we have related to D&I internally are really reflective of the real world data. Data, right? That's one of the most important places where we can honestly start having that conversation, but more importantly, really pull out some strategic initiatives around what populations we should be including and also informing our trial design. And then lastly, enhancing the diversity of our investigative sites. I've conducted numerous patient panels and have sat on those either participating or on the other side. And there's one common theme, and that is representation matters. And they want to see that not only at the site level, but from us as sponsors and from anyone that's involved in industry. So that's one of the efforts that we're moving forward with, is making sure that we're taking a careful eye and that we're diverse, our sites are diverse, and that will help lead us to more patient inclusivity and diversity in our trials.
Great. Thank you so much, Lachelle. That's really interesting to hear what Takeda is doing, and we look forward to hearing more about it during the panel discussion. Next, we'll move on to Kareem Watson from the NIH. Kareem.
Thank you so much. It's indeed a pleasure for me to be here today, representing the National Institute of Health All of Us Research Program. I'm the new Chief Engagement Officer for the All of Us Research Program, and excited, and I want to applaud Cures Within Reach to convene this panel today and have this important discussion. Next slide. So the All of Us Research Program is really a historic program, and it's a longitudinal program that's looking to gather information on 1 million or more people in the US. And our hope is that we can accelerate and really add to the robust conversation about how research can be conducted with people and for people, and address some of those pressing issues that we've had addressing health disparities. And one of the other things that's really germane to the conversation today is that the All of Us Research Program is committed to ensuring that of the 1 million or more participants that we hope to enroll in this groundbreaking study, is that those participants reflect the rich diversity of the US. Next slide. And ensuring that our participants, and my colleagues today have already alluded to this, it's not only important to ensure that the participants that we engage reflect the rich diversity of the US, which we have achieved, by the way, to date. Of the over 400,000 participants that we have enrolled in the All of Us Research Program, over 70% represent populations that are underrepresented in biomedical research. And of those, over 50% represent racial and ethnic minorities. So the intentionality that the program has put forth in ensuring diversity, equity, and inclusion on the participant side also has to be matched in what we do to ensure that the messengers matter as well. The researchers asking the question, and the diversity and equity and representation of those researchers is also important. And so another thing that the All of Us Research Program is doing is bringing together a diverse cohort of researchers. we're creating opportunities for researchers to be able to access our database, to access that information on the soon to be over 1 million participants, to be able to ask innovative questions based on their experience, their lived experience, and experience they have at the grassroots levels of working with community partners. As you've also heard from my colleagues today, the importance of working with community stakeholders who often have the local footprint and pulse of the community's needs that are taking place is also vital to the work that we do. Next slide. And this slide actually represents that we want to thank our participants to date who have enrolled, and we want to thank our community partners. As of September 2021, all of us has over 44 community stakeholders that has branches to over 116 community partners, both nationally as well as in some grassroots and local areas. And the importance of having these community partners, I'll highlight later on, is that by having partnership with community partners, that allows you to increase the trust and ensure that there's a certain level of accountability that is added to the program. Next slide. And I want to end with the slide where I want to talk to you about my own experience as a researcher, both from being a researcher from an underrepresented group in research, but also as a trained community health scientist whose work is focused on community-based participatory research. This slide actually represents what we hope to be not the exception in research, but the norm in research. This slide represents a multi-PI team that was a project that was funded by the National Cancer Institute. Prior to me joining the NIH, I was the director of community outreach and engagement for the University of Illinois at Chicago Cancer Center. And one of the projects that we were doing was addressing cancer screening and prevention in African-American men. Despite the fact that African-American men carried the highest mortality associated with lung cancer, unfortunately, African-American men were often not included in clinical trials, and researchers that reflected African-American men were actually not a part of that group that were actually asking the questions. We actually sought to combat that through a National Cancer Institute funded project called the SHARED Project. We brought together researchers that were looking at health behavior, community-based participatory research, oncology, but also looking at critical race theory. We also engaged community partners such as Barbara you see there, Kurt Eskridge from Cut It Out Kurt, and then our community lead, our community stakeholder, Mr. Marcus Murray from Project Brotherhood. And in these efforts, we were able to engage African-American men as citizen scientists to ensure that the questions that we are asking, that the interventions that we were developing were developed by, for, and with the population that carried the greatest burden of disease. This is just one example of what can happen when you work with community stakeholders to drive diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical trials. Next slide. So I want to thank the other panelists. I want to thank the organizers of this program. And I want to invite all of you, if you are a community member or a patient stakeholder and you're looking to find more information out about the All of Us research program, please go to joinallofus.org. Or if you are a researcher and want to find out how you can access our database and enhance your research by working with our very diverse samples, please go to researchallofus.org to learn more about the program. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kareem. I think that's, I love to hear about the community-based research that you did as a clinical researcher. And I think that's a perfect segue to Regina Greer-Smith with Health Research Associates. Regina?
Good morning. Let's start my slides. Good morning, everybody. I'm Regina Greer-Smith with Healthcare Research Associates. I'm a community-based organization. So when we talk about community and stakeholders, I'm the stakeholder who plugs herself and my teams and partners into any and every partnership that's looking to engage communities in health and also specifically into clinical trials. Some of the photos that you'll see in my presentation are pre-pandemic community-based outreach and engagement for clinical trials. I'm very excited to work with this team. Many of you I've known for years. Dr. Watson, thank you always for allowing me to plug myself into community-based clinical trials and events, especially starting out in Chicago, where we know that we have a really robust advocacy and community-based partnerships in Chicago. So let's start with first. We all know that our communities of color, tribal partners, and more have continued to suffer from the burdens of elevated risk, poor health outcomes, untimely diagnosis and treatments of health conditions, and unfortunately, early death than any other groups. These reasons and these events are well documented. So, our participation in clinical trials can lead to better scientific knowledge, information, and therapies about us and for us. Our participation is important to the planning, designing, and recruiting of our communities for participation in clinical trials that will benefit our health and quality of life, and also for us to help make the science better for clinical trials. So how do we awaken our communities and engage our academic, community-based partners, academics, clinics into clinical trials? Next slide, please. First, information about clinical trials must be translated and brought to our communities so we can really understand what's going on. First, we need to be educated about what exactly a clinical trial is. And I put in parentheses study because sometimes when communities hear clinical trials, they think about going to court. And we don't want anything that'll bring harm to or even misunderstanding exactly what a clinical trial is. So first, let's ask in our communities to understand, what is the purpose of a clinical trial? Why should I want to learn about them? What information and resources are available to learn from clinical trials? And I'll refer back to Shardae's work, the work that she's involved with. We have used the resources of NIH, Office of Minority Health, Medline Plus, the National Networks of Libraries of Medicine, where I have received grants and contracts to bring that information that's consumer-oriented for consumers, patients, caregivers, and advocates to really understand what clinical trials are and to learn about their chronic conditions and health disparities that impact our community. So another question, could I personally benefit from participating in a clinical trial? I've been told that clinical trials were harmful or could be dangerous to people like me. We'll refer back to the Tuskegee studies and similar ones where they know about and learn about historical harm, especially it's been really amplified during the pandemic about the vaccines. So we want to understand what this clinical trial means for me and my community. And also, many have been told that medicines and treatments that we've been prescribed or taking were not made for me because people like me were not part of a clinical trial. How did that happen? So many of these questions are coming out, and we have to be, they have to be truthfully translated and understood and answered by those bringing clinical trials into the community. It's very important for them to, for our communities to understand what clinical trials are all about, so and translated into our communities. Then next slide. One of the things that clinical trials has to be a pathway to communities and partners and relationships. We have to recognize the need for focused engagement and education that's community-based. Develop programs, information, and resources that are of interest to the community. Develop relationships and with local investigators and research staff. Develop trust with the community, extremely important and should be at the top of the list really. Participate in community health focused events that focus on clinical trials, purposes and benefits. And then most importantly, create the partnerships that provide opportunities to conduct outreach, engage education within the communities, and develop those needed partnerships so that this information and resources can be translated to the communities that need the information. And last slide. We talk about partners throughout our conversations with clinical trials. And I came up with this little mnemonic for partners. P, patients and caregivers, A, advocates, R, researchers and sponsors, T, together, and networking to E, engage, educate, and enable communities to participate in research, and S, studies for clinical trials. Again, thank you for this opportunity. I'm glad to be part of this conversation.
Wonderful. Thanks, Regina. That's a very helpful mnemonic, and I'm going to start to use that moving forward. And thanks to all of our panelists for the wonderful background and introductions. I think that really sets the stage perfectly for the panel discussion coming up. A final reminder to all our attendees, please continue to submit your questions via the engagement panel on the right-hand side of the screen. We'll get to those at the end of the panel discussion, but you don't need to wait until the end to submit. Just put them in whenever you think of them. All right, so I'm going to turn it back over now to Sade to lead the panel discussion. Sade?
Thank you, Claire. And again, a pleasure to be with everyone today, and very excited to be a part of this distinguished panel and the experts and the presentations that we've heard. And one of the things that I think is just so amazing across all of the presentations from all of our distinguished panelists is the wealth of work that's going on across all of our different organizations. And I kind of want to kick off our panel discussion talking about that a little bit more. One of the areas we know that's so important, and we've heard across the presentations, is the need to engage broadly to make sure we're engaging all stakeholders that have a touch point within this space. And we've heard about it from the perspective of a regulatory agency being FDA. We've heard about it from NIH. We've heard about it from community-based organizations as well as industry. And I want to talk about that a little bit more when we start to think about the fact that all of our organizations have work in this space. We're all doing work in this space. And Lachelle, I think, really said this and highlighted this importantly, that we've all been doing work in this space for a very long time. So I want to talk a little bit more about how we view our organization's roles in this space. And I'll kind of tee it up with talking a little bit about FDA's role. This is actually a question I get quite often as well, with what is FDA's role when we talk about diversity in clinical trials? FDA, of course, we are a regulatory agency, so we are not conducting the trial, but across our agency, our centers, the review divisions within those centers, they are reviewing the data that is submitted. So they're experts across our agency, multidisciplinary experts are reviewing the data and ultimately working to determine if that product is safe and effective, and then of course, approving that product. And I think that's one way to highlight FDA's role. But within that, we are also engaging with industry. We're working with industry. I highlighted how we also have guidance documents that our agency has issued that work to encourage diverse enrollment and retention and recruitment in clinical trials. And I also talked a little bit about some of the other broader stakeholder engagement and outreach and communication efforts, where we have, for example, the campaign within the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity. We've hosted public meetings. So we really work to make sure that we're engaging broadly, especially with our patient engagement activities. There's a lot of work going on across our agency in this space, including patient-focused drug development efforts. So we really work to make sure that we're engaging across all of the stakeholders that work with FDA, especially as we're working to advance diversity in clinical trials. And I want to go over to Lachelle now. Lachelle, I know you talked about a lot of the work within Takeda. I want to see if you can expand a little bit on your thoughts related to industry's role in advancing diversity in clinical trials.
Yeah, so I think that we play a very, very strong role in setting the standard. I mean, all of us have our individual company efforts that we're standing up, but we really have that obligation to really put forth how important it is to us as a company by our actions, right? So I think back to even something as simple as having a metric or standard in place across the entire organization and how that can really move change. I talked a lot about addressing operational barriers, but for me, it really starts with taking a look at the diseases that we're studying and then the people that impacts. Oftentimes, you know, I've heard over the years, we can't slow down the rate of our trials to make sure that patients are participating or for diversity. But I argue back that we have to, right? At the end of the day, our patients are going to be the people that are actually taking our medications. So taking a step back and looking at who is going to be taking that medication at the end of the day allows us as sponsors to say, okay, these are the certain inclusion exclusion criterion that we need to be accountable for. These are the patients that we need to include, and ask about our trial design and how we set up those patient panels to really get that feedback proactively. I often think about this big push for decentralized trials and how that is being thought of as a way to expand. Well, in speaking to patients, oftentimes there's a little bit of a hybrid. There's a desire to have that opportunity to still engage with the investigator while having that option for that hybrid opportunity so that they can expand access and kind of continue with their life. But if we don't take that step back and think about who is actually going to take our medication and use that as the driver for operations, use that as the driver for orchestrating our protocol, using that as the driver for even our patient recruitment plans and our community outreach, we can't really go much of anywhere. So again, industry has that obligation to look at that patient population and make sure we're including them from the very beginning. And that's communicated to our sites and any other CRO that is executing our trial.
I think that is a really important point that we, of course, we always have to put patients first and remember why we're even conducting these trials. And you also brought up another important area that Kareem, you talked about, and that's really thinking about our investigators. And so I wanted to turn to you to get your thoughts on not only how you view NIH's role in this space, but maybe expanding a little bit more on what you see might be some of the biggest hurdles or challenges facing investigators, minority investigators, underrepresented investigators that are really trying to get into the space of being an investigator and being able to lead clinical trials.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ra. That's a really great question. And when I think about the NIH's role in diversifying the investigators, if you think about it, the NIH as a whole is the largest federal funder of clinical trials in the United States. So it's very important for the NIH to have an invested interest in ensuring that the investigators that they're funding represent the populations that carry the greatest burden of disease. When I think about what we're doing with that, with the All of Us research program, I think about intentional efforts that we have. We recently funded program support to Baylor University, as an example, to ensure that Baylor University was developing programming, training, and activities to ensure increased access to some historically HBCUs, historical Black college universities, minority serving institutions, Hispanic serving institutions, and the investigators that are doing research within those institutions. The reason why this is so important is because access matters too. Getting access to understanding the funding infrastructure. My own personal experience in that, I have to give a shout out to Dr. Robert Nguyen, the director of the VCU Macy Cancer Center, because it was Dr. Nguyen that introduced me to the concept of diversity supplements and administrative supplements. These are things that are baked into the National Institute of Health Research Awards often, and these can give you access to startup funds and supported funds that can get you the early data that you need. There's been many reports out there that people are reading that shows that the number of investigators who get that gold standard award, that NIH R01 award, is very few, and that number is very limited for investigators that are from underrepresented groups. I was fortunate enough prior to joining the NIH to actually receive a multi-PI R01, and I would not have even gotten access to the data that I needed to do the research through that R01 through two important entities. One, without my community stakeholders, I would not have data that represent the communities that were carrying the greatest burden of lung cancer and prostate cancer screening. Two, if it were not for Dr. Nguyen giving me an opportunity through support from funding that he got through the NCI. But when I talk to other investigators, early stage investigators, many of them have never heard of diversity supplements. Many of them have never heard of administrative supplements. Many of them have never heard of pipeline programs. And I'm really proud of some efforts that are happening at the NIH, particularly, I think, a place like at NCI that has programs called the YES, R25, Youth Enjoy Science. I still remember being a part of pipeline programs in my local hometown in Muskegon, Michigan. That was through our urban league. That pipeline program was to expose me to STEM and leadership. The importance of those pipeline programs is so important to get us through, to get us access and awareness to them, to get us tied into the research machine.
Thank you, Kareem. I agree. I think that, one of the areas that's so important is making sure that there's the mentorship, making sure that we can have that sustained mentorship is so critically important as we are working to grow and train minority investigators, new investigators, and really get them engaged in research. And I know I'll highlight for our office within the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity, one of the areas that we focus on, and while we're not the big funder like NIH with grants and the amazing programs that you just described, Kareem, with some of the ways that you're able to train investigators, but one of the areas that we do focus on is providing those opportunities for minority investigators to be able to come to FDA, learn the work that we do, and continue to grow in the space of health disparities. One of the ways that we do that is through our Health Equity and Genomic Science Fellowship that we now have that we're really excited about. This is in collaboration with the National Human Genome Research Institute at NIH. So it highlights how we are collectively all thinking about ways that we can continue to grow minority investigators. But one of the areas that you mentioned that was consistent across all of our presentations that we highlighted is the need to engage community organizations. And Regina, of course, you are the expert in this space, so I'm excited to turn to you now to really get you to talk a little bit more about how you view that role, the role of community-based organizations in this space, and also talk a little bit more about how do we best engage with community organizations and the community.
Okay. It's extremely important for communities to see people like Kareem and Lachelle come to us and share what they're doing, the research, and how it's important for us to be educated about what these pharmaceuticals, what this research means, and the impact for our community. We do know that place matters as far as what medication or research will look like in our communities. Oftentimes, many of us cannot participate in research or even learn about it because our work requirements, caregiving requirements, transportation, et cetera. So it's very important that there are breakthroughs, meaning that we have committed investigators and industry people like Kareem and Lachelle to come to our community and really make the commitment to want to partner with community-based organizations and people like me who actually, I plug myself into anything that involves research in the community, whether from academia, from industry, or from the government, to see and tell community folks, see, let's see what's going on. They want to come and share it with us. So let's give them a chance, either virtually now, which has really been a great breakthrough for many communities to learn more about research and do some, I'll call investigation and research on their own, with resources and information that's in our language and at the non-academic, non-governmental level that we can understand that what's going on in our community and why it's important for us to participate in it and to really ask these really committed partners what's going on and can you tell me more about it, and have it translated so that we can understand it and make our own decisions about research. So industry partners, government partners, and academic partners are really important that look like us in our community and have the commitment and the level of trust that we can build to work with our communities to learn about research in the community, and then have a committed either community-based organization or a person like me, as I mentioned, who plugs herself in and really kind of like, I'll say, gather the community troops to see what's going on with this research that can impact us and to see what our chronic conditions are. We have to look at public health data. We work with people to see what's going on. You know, this has really come to the forefront during the pandemic to find out how things are impacting us. So it's important for us to be partnered with partners such as you to help us understand so that we can have a clear understanding and trust those who come to share these clinical trials with us.
Thank you, Regina. And, you know, when we think about how we are engaging with community organizations, you talked about how the importance of engaging across all of the different, you know, from academic institutions and others. One of the areas that I'm a little curious about is, especially with the wide range that each of you have worked from an industry perspective, from an NIH perspective, and maybe I'll start with you, Kareem, to get a little bit more information on where you think there have been those best practices or lessons learned, especially in the space of advancing diversity in clinical trials, and what you've seen I think not only from your NIH perspective, but also from the work that you did prior to NIH.
Thank you so much for that question. I'll talk about some best practices, and I'll talk about it in the frame of when I've seen it where we need to make improvements and how that hopefully we're seeing us turn that corner. I talked earlier about some of the work that I was doing in the Chicagoland area around lung cancer disparities. And that work was actually done in collaboration with federally qualified health centers. One of my colleagues earlier, one of you all said that place matters. That is so true. And one of the things when I looked at was that if we're not conducting research in the places and spaces where people go, people shouldn't have to take 2 buses and a train to be able to find out how to get access to a clinical trial. Those clinical trials should be taking place in the spaces in the places where those community members are, such as federally qualified health center. But when we develop those clinical trials, we have to develop them with the leadership and the providers of the federally qualified health centers to ensure that we're not creeping away from their mission, which is to provide primary care. One example of how we saw that in a way as a best practice was one of the larger studies, the National Lung Cancer Screening Trial, which is actually funded by the NIH, was groundbreaking in what we learned about low-dose CT for the early detection of lung cancer. But unfortunately, that study lacked the diversity and inclusion to really allow us to think about some of those nuance and contextual factors that lead to the continuing morbidity and mortality that we see in Black and brown communities that are impacted by lung cancer. Well, one of the things that I think is happening now as a best practice, the NIH is addressing these things, and now they're looking at you'll see funding proposals asking you to address social determinants of health, to address systemic racism, to work with community partners, to work with community health centers. And even the grant that I was funded right before coming to the NIH was to conduct that lung cancer research screening program right there in collaboration with the federally qualified health center across 3 universities, including 2 minority serving institutions. And also providing opportunities for us to have pipeline and entry-level work where students, research assistants could engage in that research project who also reflect the rich diversity of the population that we're serving. I think that's a best practice where you are bringing all the teams together, all the resources together, conducting the research in the place and space where the disparity is the greatest, and ensuring that the research team is reflective of the population as well. I think that's a best practice that we've learned from when the larger study was not inclusive, how we're now asking those tough questions of how do I ensure equity and inclusion through all aspects of the research study, not just the recruitment of participants, but from the design to the study implementation, all the way to data return.
Yeah, I think that is so true. And, when we think about, I can just think about ways that we've engaged with the community. I think one of the first things that we hear oftentimes is, if my provider, my community provider, the person I see actually recommended a trial or just even raised, maybe I should learn more about this, then I would do it. I would consider it. And I think that's so important. So the more that we are able to directly engage with the community, I think we'll continue to see, as you said, success in this space. And the other area that I'll say here is, we also want to make sure that we have that bidirectional engagement and sustained engagement. We want to make sure that as we're building these relationships, how do we make them sustainable? How do we make them long-term and where we're continuing to engage? So maybe, Regina, I'll ask you that one based off your experience. How can we make the engagement with the community sustainable and really building a long-lasting relationship and trusted relationship?
That's really important. Thank you for that question. In my experience and with many communities, the outreach begins with conversations and really building those relationships from the community standpoint. As Kareem says, it's got to come, the research has to begin and be sustained in the communities at FQHCs, school-based programs, churches. Our faith-based partners are very important, and ensuring that there's maybe even a memorandum of understanding and really guidelines that are developed by the community to ensure that those relationships are sustained. And actually, funding is very important to ensure that, or to make sure that community people are part of the administration of many of these clinical trials engagement, especially from the point of convening meetings, hosting researchers. We know It takes time and money to create spaces and to have administration in communities. So making the community partner part of the funding and of a contract, and really making them feel part and showing that their participation is important, needed, and appreciated by providing a funding stream to support their administrative and their costs for being in the community. And then I'll say also, community people are extremely important for training and orientating their members to research. And that provides a sustainability infrastructure to ensuring that PI or that organization is keeps a presence in the community by really making sure that those partnerships are sustained by continuation of conversation, asking questions, coming to where the community is, place matters, as I mentioned before, and ensuring that there's the partnerships sustained by making sure that their bi-directional relationships are continued, and really offering that trust and reciprocal relationships are in place.
Yeah, I think that's really important, making sure that we meet people where they are, you meet the community where they are, and working to build that trust. And the best way to build that trust is to show that you are working towards a bi-directional, sustained, long-term relationship. Kareem, did you want to add anything to that?
I did. I just want to express the importance of what Regina said, and of also valuing that community partner is so important in an equitable way. Value them both in the brain trust that they bring, but also in the resources. It was Regina, as a community advocate and a community stakeholder, that first told me about a national funding mechanism. I didn't get that inside academia. That came from a community member. And it came in a place because we had a space where we would invite community members to come in and share ideas with us. But that information came from Regina. And I want to make sure that we talk about also the importance of academic partners and industry and governmental partners being present prior to we need participation in research. Part of that sustainability is being present before we ask the research question and present after we've gotten the information from that research study.
I completely agree. And making sure that we have patients, the community at the table from the very beginning. Not when you're already into developing the protocol, but all the way at the very, very beginning. Completely agree. And I'm going to see, Lachelle, do you want to add anything to that as well?
And I was going to say, even still, it's great to have you at the very beginning, but throughout the continuum. I can't say how much working even before at Takeda, that engaging ongoing and continuing to look at the screen failures, looking at where we're getting our enrollment from, and continuing to probe our investigators. I think back to one of the very first programs that I worked on that was in Alzheimer's disease, and it has an over-index in certain populations. And we were noticing a higher screen failure rate. This was supposed to be a pretty marvel way to treat Alzheimer's. And I had the opportunity to actually go visit the investigators and sit there with their study coordinators and, see what was happening. Well, the first and foremost, they pointed out our materials, right? We were in South Miami and we had no Spanish materials. That was one of the first things that they pointed out. How can you come and engage with us when you have imagery that doesn't even reflect our people? And then second to that, the places where we were advertising and that our great agencies had engaged with were general audience, general marketing. And so we were missing those opportunities to engage and really meet the community where they were at. But then even furthermore, we dug into the protocol, and he alerted, a lot of people that are coming to see me. And the part of the reason I got into research is there's a gap in insurance, and you have arduous screening requirements that are required. And so even before I'm ever even able to give them the opportunity, we've eliminated 90% of my patients. What can you do about that? And so from there, I remember meeting with investigator, and we were actually able to provide budgeting for screening. But it was only because of that ongoing engagement with those investigators throughout that continuum of the trial that we were really able to course correct and continue, with that particular trial. So again, I think it's imperative to have patient participation, investigator participation, not only at the beginning, but through that entire trial and through the whole entire process so you can stay engaged. And to your point, we can't just show up when we want to enroll. We have to be there after our trial's done, because we know we're going to first want to go back to those particular sites. But more important, the patients need to know the data. What happened to them, right? What happened after that? And so again, the importance of being there throughout the entire trial is the only way that we can have those sustainable relationships, not just with the community patients, but with our community investigators that we're asking to help out.
Yeah.
Can I
And-
add to that? Okay,
Go ahead, Regina.
I also want to add to what Lachelle said, that what happens after the engagement activities and trial is extremely important. Now, we know of instances, and has happened often, that once the trial is over or the engagement protocol is over, you never hear from the investigator anymore. And communities have gotten very savvy now that they'll come knocking on the investigator's door of the organization. Hey, what happened to the data? What happened to the organization? We participated in it, but what happened? So, it could be a point of contention, unfortunately, and embarrassment that, they close the loop and continue those partnerships to ensure that there's full disclosure as to what happened with that research, what were the results. And remember, the data belongs to the communities. So it's important that they remain included in that process of closing out and really reporting back.
I think that reporting back is really important, because you think about, if you can, of course, having that long-term sustained relationship, but also making sure that you talk and find out what's some feedback from participation that can help you in building your next trial. So, that feedback and that bi-directional and the constant engagement, I think, is really important, especially when we are working to continue to advance success in the space. One of the other areas that I want to circle back to, and Lachelle, you mentioned this, and it's kind of come up broadly, where we've talked about, making sure that we are engaging early, making sure that we have that continuous engagement, not just at the beginning, but also how we're engaging investigators. We talked about engaging community organizations. But one of the other areas that I wanted to bring up that you talked about earlier was the types of trials, right? So we think about decentralized clinical trials, and this has definitely been in the spotlight recently because with our remote settings right now under the pandemic. So just wanted to talk a little bit more about this across all the panelists. Anyone, please feel free to add to this. Just wanted to think how you think we can continue to advance telehealth, remote participation, expanding technology. But as that continues to evolve, I guess my question would be, how can we make sure that as these decentralized trials are developed, how do we make sure that racial and ethnic minority diverse populations are included, that they're not excluded from this advancement?
Let me start with, I'm doing lots of work here in the Southern Cal area, and I actually live in the desert. I have found that technology, texting, smartphones have really enabled communities to participate in clinical trials, especially because of the pandemic. It has been seamless as far as ensuring inclusion, especially in engagement. Listening tours, sessions such as these have been extremely impactful and powerful in developing new relationships and maintaining them as well. So to the extent that we can ensure that we have these robust networks, Zoom, using smartphones to communicate and to engage, and even text messaging, something that everyone is familiar with and everyone uses, more so than just talking on the phone, can really make a big difference to ensure that engagement here continues.
And to continue on with what Regina said, I think there's so much for us to learn from best practices and lesson learned from what we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think one of the things I like to do as a community health scientist is that I like to learn from other fields, including our educational fields. So I think as health scientists, we actually have to take some time and do a look and do a deeper dive to see what was happening in our public school system. Who were those populations that were impacted by homeschooling or impacted, by virtual classrooms? And what inequities did we see? And then intervene upon those inequities. If we knew what zip codes saw a decline in student participation, as a result of lack of bandwidth, broadband use, or the digital divide, as we call it, in the All of Us research program, I think that could let us know that those populations may also be impacted by lack of access to clinical trials. In the All of Us research program, we are actively thinking about what are those barriers, both historic and present, that would prevent populations from doing digital access to these studies. When you think of a lot of the mistrust, I use the term justified medical mistrust. And I think by calling that mistrust justified, it acknowledges and owns some of the injustices that have happened to populations. And when we think about what would be those barriers that would prevent populations, I also think we have to look at our community health centers. Again, bringing my experience back from the federally qualified health center where I used to work, we looked at our patient portal. Which one of our patients were not likely to log onto the patient portal may be the same patient that may not be likely to be active and engaged in a clinical trial. And what can we learn from those spaces and places? And utilizing innovative community partners such as community health workers and community health educators, I think, are something that we've underutilized in the clinical research space.
And I'm going to take a stab at this too, but Kareem, you took my exact example because I think about when all of us were forced to work from home and my first thought was school. I'm a former school teacher, right? I taught high school physics for a number of years before I jumped into industry. And one of the first things that happened to me, was access to even something as simple as a calculator. Some of my students had access to nice TI 83s and some, that $100 calculator was too much. Well, I always caution we're kind of doing the same thing if we start throwing too much technology and creating that digital divide. Right now, I'm actually in a clinical trial. Furthermore, I thought it was important that if I'm going to ask people to be in a clinical trial, I need to be part of that experience. But I was required to have a device. Every week, the study coordinator calls me and I have to have the ability to download the app. If the app works with my phone, great. But if it doesn't, then that's another issue. So thinking back from a sponsor perspective, I always want to make sure that if we're going to incorporate technology, that we incorporate in a very smart manner and also are very cognizant of the site burden. I mean, the site is really that channel to the patient. And if they are having issues with their technology, they already have so many systems that they have to actually incorporate to execute a trial. It can in turn create a very, very negative experience for our patients. And as Kareem said, sometimes there's that mistrust that already exists. So again, I think careful incorporation and really looking at who are the have and have nots and filling in that gap. So for example, if we're going to require that you have to have a device, then we need to be prepared to actually provide that to really make sure that we're not creating another digital divide and we're really creating that equitable access, not just equal, but equitable access to our clinical trials and taking that strategic approach.
Yeah, and with that strategic approach, with everything that you just said, Lachelle, one of the things that would be very important is including patients in the upstream planning. There, making sure that you get that feedback at the very beginning and continuously. And I want to circle back to, I had the opportunity to ask Kareem about best practices and lessons learned. And I want to circle to you with the same question, Lachelle. And again, in the same space as we think about diversity in clinical trials, what would you say are some best practices or lessons learned that you've seen specifically from an industry perspective? And how do you think that industry can continue to advance in this space?
So planning from the onset and having that intentional plan from the very beginning. I have worked on trials where all of a sudden we're in midstream, sites are placed, materials are made, protocols finalized, and all of a sudden we want to talk about diversity. And it makes it very, very, very difficult, to communicate to sites that this is now important when we're in midstream and we've already had everything laid out. So really starting from the beginning and being intentional with saying diversity is important and these are the populations that should be included in our trial is one of the best practices that we have to start thinking about. Because again, as I mentioned, from there, that really dictates how we operationalize our trial and can also influence the data at the very, very end. So starting from the very beginning is critical in combination with including our community stakeholders.
Yeah, and that's the perfect segue to Regina. Also want to hear from you what you think the best practice or lesson learned is.
One of the things that I think is very important, Kareem mentioned it in his statements, partnerships in the community, especially with the FQACs, where many are where our underserved community members get their primary care, and having research embedded or started at that point where the providers that the community people trust can ask questions and get information and resources and education about clinical trials for their specific condition. So the partnerships and the relationships at the community level are extremely important. And then at those sites, as Kareem also mentioned, community health workers, really displaying and introducing an outreach from that level, from the community level, especially our QAC partners, is extremely important. And then we bring in our partnerships with the community health centers, with the academic medical centers and industry, makes a really robust and an important infrastructure for introducing community people to community trials, clinical trials, because community partners, community providers are extremely important because the trust is already built there. And I think we can really make some breakthroughs as ensuring diversity and inclusion in clinical trials from the community level.
Thank you, Regina. And I think we now have some questions that are coming in from our audience. So I'm going to take a moment and ask some of these questions to our panelists. The first one talks a little bit about what programs at NIH and FDA exist for engaging students and young professionals. So thinking about fellowships and internships. And I'll mention here one that I raised earlier. We have our Genomic Science and Health Equity fellowship this is one of our newest fellowships that we recently launched within the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity at FDA. It's really exciting for us to be launching this. And of course, this is actually in collaboration with NIH's National Human Genome Research Institute, or NHGRI. So that is one example of a fellowship program. Another area that we have within the FDA is our pharmacy student experiential program. So the one thing that I will say, we also want to be able to engage early on with our healthcare providers and professionals as they're in their training. So we have pharmacy students that rotate through our office. We have public health students, we have physicians and other disciplines that will rotate through our office. And we think that's really important so they can learn about FDA, learn about the work that we do, and also learn about the work that we do within the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity. And ways that you can learn more about those opportunities can be found on our website. And I had that link on the slide, so I think those will be shared later. And so I'm going to turn to Kareem now so he can expand on some of the opportunities in this space from NIH.
Thank you so much, Sade. And again, I want to start with my own lived experience. I came to the program, I came to NIH funding as a graduate student, again, with support through a diversity supplement and administrative supplement. And those are things that researchers can find out more about. You can talk to your program officer, and you can talk to your faculty, or if you see, and I often encourage students to find out who at your university has NIH funding. And research offices and institutes at schools and in academia can let you know who has that NIH funding. But more importantly, for the All of Us research program, one of the partnerships that we have is with Pyxis Partners. And with Pyxis Partners, we're collaborating with the Black Greek Association, the Pan-Hellenic Association, to make sure that fraternities and sororities are aware of research and student-led projects. We're also partnering with HBCUs, and like I said before, the partnership with Baylor University. So upcoming this spring, we're going to have our second annual Minority Student Research Symposium, where we'll actually have students that will be paired with mentors, so those students can learn how to access genomic data, how to ask particular questions about genomics data, and expanding those opportunities, and then the researcher workbench. And those opportunities to get access to the research workbench, you can go to allofus.gov to find out more about opportunities across, no matter where you are, from being a postdoc or a pre-doctoral student to an early stage investigator.
Thank you, Kareem. And we have another question that came in from the audience, and I think it's a good segue with the information that was just shared. And I'll pose this to anyone to answer. The question is, are there stakeholders or others in the research process that aren't as engaged as they should be? And who needs to be included besides patients? So I'll pose that to anyone that wants to answer and expand on who else we think should be engaged in this process beyond patients.
So this is Lachelle. I'll take that one. So aside from just patients, also thinking about that circle of influence, right? A lot of patients have other people that they need to consult about their medical decisions. And so not just the patients, but also considering family members that may partake into that particular process. But also looking at, from a community standpoint, one of the aspects that I've seen increasingly come important over the years is not just engaging with our investigative sites or those physicians that actually do research, but looking to expand, like our nurse practitioners, physician assistants, all of those people that more diverse communities may engage with just around their normal healthcare. Why not provide more education about how that clinical research process impacts them? So again, that by the time they're getting to hear about research, there's a little bit more information. It's coming from a trusted source. It's not such a jarring experience when you're looking at an oncology trial, for example, and that's the first time that you've heard from research. And then furthermore, again, going back to patients, they have really communicated that they want to hear about clinical research earlier in the process before they're being prescribed a medication. So why not engage some of those people that are not necessarily conducting the actual clinical research trials, but still can be part of that ecosystem and still are part of that healthcare ecosystem?
I echo everything Michelle just said. And I've approached this, from an ecological model. The CDC has a great social ecological model that I've actually adapted to think about how do we increase that for clinical trial participation. At that individual level, you have the patient, the participant, but at that interpersonal level, that's where we talk about the relationship between that patient and their primary care provider. You said it, someone said it earlier, that patient is probably more likely going to adhere to the instructions and the guidance from that primary care provider who they hopefully have a trusted relationship with versus a researcher who they may have a one-time engagement with. So it's important at that interpersonal level, we take full advantage, like Lachelle said, of the entire ecosystem of the healthcare team, not just the provider, but also the community health worker, the nurse practitioner, because we think about provider may have 15 minutes to spend with that patient. But that community health worker, that nurse, they will have a lot more time to actually spend with that patient, educating them about the importance. But also in that ecological model, we have policy on that outer ring, right? The Lung Cancer Project I was working on is great, but if I don't work with policy organizations like the American Lung Association and other organizations to think about the criteria for lung cancer screening and ensuring that there's policies to support diversity in clinical trial, the information I obtained from my research studies will only go so far if it can't be sustained and implemented through policy and advocacy work.
I'd like to also add that I have found that our mental health community can be extremely important partners in working with our community, in addition to our healthcare providers. Now, I've worked with groups who said, I'm so busy and stressed out, I can't even think about, not let alone deal with a clinical trial, my own health, because I'm a caregiver. So to the extent that we can support people's mental health and empower them to overcome some of the barriers, even taking care of their own health because they may be working too much. We know our frontline workers and our first responders during the pandemic have been extremely important in supporting communities. So I'll say our mental health providers and our first responders, even think about paramedics and maybe fire department and possibly law enforcement can be part of the partnership in the communities.
Thank you. And we have two questions, and I'm going to do my best to combine these two audience questions because I think they're both really important. The questions are asking, how do we, for example, non-diverse or non-racial and ethnic minority investigators, what recommendations do we have for non-diverse PIs to be able to engage and advance in the space of health disparities, learn in the space of health disparities, but also to be able to engage and respectfully engage with diverse communities so that research can better reflect the community?
Yeah, so from an industry's perspective, so first and foremost, I graduated from Tuskegee University. So when I think of research, this is really the reason why I entered into the industry, right? Is to address that mistrust and to be part of that solution. So one of the first things that I did was work in patient recruitment. I thought I wanted to do operations, but I really discovered that sitting in that site space and sitting in that patient space was really how I could make that difference. And I would do a lot of conferences and workshops with investigators. And one of the first things that I would hear is, well, I only ask patients who I think will qualify. I only ask patients who I think are interested. Or I know my patients very well, so I know which patients would be more likely to participate and stay in a trial. And right there, you can kind of hear the bias. And we know that, quite frankly, only about 30% of minorities that are ever participating in clinical research are ever asked. So you have a whole lot of people who have had to take that very, very personal engagement, find their own clinical trial. They weren't asked by a healthcare provider. And some of the reasons that I hear, well, African Americans don't trust clinical research, or, well, I'm not sure if they'll be able to understand the informed consent. So I would say from that perspective, really think about if you're offering your trials to every single patient, regardless of their circumstance, and allow that natural dialogue. Allow them to tell you what their concerns are. Allow them to tell you their challenges, because I think that you'll find that having that conversation will build that rapport, and you'll also be able to address those challenges that are very, very unique to that individual. And there could be an opportunity for both of you all to learn and grow from that engagement.
Michelle, you brought up a really important point. And one of the things that reminded me of, there's a lot of evidence-based literature out there that's talking about how bias can creep in, even into the patient-provider interaction. That implicit bias, can creep in where you don't have the intentionality of excluding certain populations, but unfortunately that bias can creep into the design and the way you recruit and engage participants. So that's one. There was someone asked about how can, if you are from a group that's more represented in research, how can you be almost, I look at it as being an ally and a support. And one of the ways that I also think that you can do that is ask yourself the tough question of who's not at the table and why. If you are just as a man, if I'm going into a research program to conduct cervical cancer research, I want to make sure that I have members of my research team that reflect the population I'm going to study. I've actually been engaged in international research looking at cervical cancer in Ethiopia and Uganda. And the reason I was so well received was because the team was led by Dr. Galela Goba, someone who was from that community area, someone who understood that lived experience. So you have to ask yourself who's at the table, who's not at the table, and how. And then also understand how you can utilize your privilege and power to create access and opportunities for others. The multi-PI opportunity, that's where you as a researcher can bring other researchers on board alongside you in an equitable leadership role. I often tell PIs when I look at their applications and I say, are you the only one that can be the principal investigator in this application? And is that person that you have as a co-investigator, can they be elevated up to the role of multi-PI? If they cannot, what can you do throughout the study process to get them that skills and those assets to be on the equitable playing field as you? And then of course, this team science approach, we have to borrow from other disciplines. The experience may not be directly in your wheelhouse, but there may be someone else in another industry, community, or other places. So thank you all so much.
Thank you all. And Kareem, we have another question. I'm going to pose this one to you based off your work with all of us. The question is, when we think about engaging communities of color in broader research efforts, so when we think about, for example, prevention or where we're going to be obtaining genetic information, there may be challenges to engaging communities of color with this type of research. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you've seen?
100%. And I'll zero in on some work that we've done with American and Alaska Native AIAN populations. When you think about the cultural sensitivity and the cultural nuances that you have to think about and how you collect biospecimen, how you collect genomic information, how you even return that information. And the way we did it was own that there are some sensitivities, but there also are some best practices. We don't have to invent the best practices. There's tons of people who have done research in a culturally sensitive and culturally tailored way. We can learn from those researchers. Also listening. Before we are getting engaged with the collecting and the return of data to some of our AIAN participants, we're actually conducting listening sessions with tribal council leadership. So we can learn from them what are some things from a cultural nuance perspective that we should be thinking about, particularly as it relates to genomic information and biospecimens. And you can learn more about these efforts on our allofus.gov site. I know we're almost at time, but I wanted to make sure that, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to get that information out.
Thank you, and I can't express how much listening sessions are critically important. I know that is definitely how we develop and expand our work, and including our campaigns and other efforts. So this has really been such a engaging conversation. And I thank all of you for the information that you have shared. I know I have also continued to learn more from each of you, even during this panel discussion. And I want to close this out with leaving with one question to each of you. And I guess we'll do kind of a rapid fire across all of us. And I'll start with Lachelle. Wanted to see if you could say the one thing that you would want to make sure that patients or caregivers would take away from this conversation.
Well, so one thing that we could take away for patients and caregivers, I know personally, I think it's important for you to know that we are going to stay the course. We are going to stay focused on the challenge. We are going to continue to address it. I think oftentimes in industry, we have trends of being innovative, patient-centric, site centricity. These are all things that since I've been in the industry have had different levels of importance. But for this, I want to just say that this is something to me that feels a little bit differently. There is dedicated resources. If you look across industry, companies are literally putting people that were in working groups and saying, tackle this as your, ancillary job, and now have people dedicated to tackling this issue holistically. So we're staying focused. We're going to stay the course. And I also say, give us the room to be patient, because I know for myself, this is something I saw from the very, very entry, and it's not going to change overnight. But those little things that we can keep doing over and over again really kind of can really add up over the long haul. So again, just, allow us to stay focused, stay the course, and we won't let this slide by. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Regina.
Yes, I'd like for a message to community-based organizations, advocates, and community health workers to continue your partnerships with the communities and with providers and academic centers to be the leaders and the gatekeepers for research and community trials, so that clinical trials, so that we can continue to build those partnerships, as Lachelle said, keep the sustainability, and to ensure that we're all part of the clinical trial community, so we can help really bring the studies and design them to ensure that we're included and they address our questions and our health conditions.
Thank you, Regina. Kareem?
And thank you so much. And as Regina said, I think from the All of Us research program, one of the takeaways that we want our listeners to know, but both our research community and our participants, is for the participants is that we are committed to ensuring that our participants are our partners. And we have multiple places in the program where we can hear from participants and how we can better develop our program, where the data that we're collecting can be returned back to you in a way that you define as value. The other piece of that is our commitment to researchers. We've been intentional, and we are succeeding in our diversity of our patient population. We want to be have that same intentionality around ensuring that researchers reflect the rich diversity of our US as well. And so thank you all for this opportunity.
Thank you, Kareem. And I will close very quickly because we are over time, to just say that the one question I get all the time, and I will say I echo every comment that's been made, the commitment, the dedication that we will continue this work. And the one question I get all the time is, how do I know if this product works for me? And the way that we know that is if we have diverse participation in clinical trials. So thank you so much for the opportunity to participate and be here with everyone today. And I will turn it back to Claire. Thank you.
Thank you, Sade. And I'll turn it to Barbara to say a few words and then back to me.
Wonderful. Thank you. I want to just thank the four speakers so much for such a robust and wonderful opportunity to hear from true experts in this field. It's such a great opportunity for patients and caregivers to hear from experts, to be more proactive and more engaged. As we heard, representation matters, intentionality matters, reciprocal relationships matters, and certainly staying the course for all of us in all of our work. So thank you again so much to each of you for your time and sharing your expertise today. The closing part of our event today is going to be our Global Health Repurposing Awards. I'm going to turn it back over to Claire.
Great, thank you, Barbara. And again, thank you to all the panelists. It was such a fantastic discussion. As Barbara mentioned, the last part of our program now is our Global Health Repurposing Awards. This is the 9th year that we have recognized leaders in repurposing in the areas of philanthropy, industry, and research. And like our prior awardees, this year's class, they have been working in the area of repurposing for many years to create that patient impact. But one thing that sets them apart is that in 2020, each of them were able to pivot their repurposing efforts and focus it on the COVID-19 pandemic. And you'll be hearing a little bit more about these efforts in a moment. But we're very excited to be recognizing them. We will start first with the Golan Christie Taglia Patient Impact Philanthropy Award.
Cures Within Reach presents the 2021 Patient Impact Philanthropy Award to Cure ID. This tool from the FDA and NCATS at the NIH allows clinicians and researchers to share repurposing case reports as a means to identify drugs for further study in clinical trials. We honor the development and launch of Cure ID for infectious diseases and soon for other diseases as well. We especially recognize the enhancements that the FDA and NCATS at the NIH made to Cure ID to help assist in the ongoing COVID-19 response. Cure ID is an example of the government's critical role in the repurposing ecosystem and the FDA and the NIH's longtime commitment to enhancing drug development for difficult to treat diseases. Congratulations to the entire Cure ID team.
It is really my great honor to be receiving this award to recognize the work that's being done in repurposing. This was a platform that was begun in 2013 as a case reporting tool from clinicians and has expanded in many of the areas that were talked about today amongst your panelists in terms of patient engagement, use of digital health tools, electronic health record extraction, and other ways of collecting data that can be used for hypothesis generation. The opportunity that drug repurposing presents to identify treatments that could be helpful for patients lacking adequate approved therapies is immense. And that's what our team has really been focused on, is how to benefit the most patients with the greatest unmet need. So I would like to thank all of the many members of our team. As I said, this is really a joint effort begun by FDA's Office of Medical Policy and then the NCATS National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences at NIH. And now in partnership, our public-private partnership that was formed actually near the start of the pandemic and really helped to launch our efforts in the COVID space, the Cure Drug Repurposing Collaboratory, which is housed by the Critical Path Institute that was mentioned in the Duchenne space as well. I think having these conveners who can bring all of the stakeholders together makes us all the more powerful. So thank you so much for this recognition. We're very grateful and appreciate the opportunity.
Great, thank you, Heather. I know that this has been years of hard work on behalf of you and the Cure ID team. So we're really excited to see this incredible tool and where it will go and how it will help repurposing. Now let's move on to the Patient Impact Industry Award.
Cures Within Reach presents the 2021 Patient Impact Industry Award to Eli Lilly and Company. We honor Lilly's ongoing commitment to improving the lives of patients with unmet medical needs. During the COVID-19 pandemic, this has been through its support of baricitinib, an existing rheumatoid arthritis medication to treat certain hospitalized COVID-19 patients, among its other initiatives. Baricitinib has been authorized for emergency use by the FDA in combination with remdesivir. In addition, Lilly has continued to test already approved therapies for new indications, including duloxetine for fibromyalgia and ramucirumab for various cancers after it was first approved for stomach cancer. Congratulations to the entire Eli Lilly family.
Hello, My name is Robert Baker, and on behalf of my company, Eli Lilly and Company, I am very pleased to accept the 2021 Patient Impact Industry Award from Cures Within Reach. My role at Lilly is Deputy Chief Medical Officer, and there I'm accountable for the conduct of our medical research and design of our clinical research, as well as medical quality and decisions like whether we advance medicines into individual humans for the first time, and if they make it all the way through testing, how we label them for the prescribers who will use them. Lilly was founded 145 years ago, focused on trying to improve the life of patients by discovering and marketing medications that will meet unmet medical needs. We've continued that to the present day, and as we've done that, one approach has often been to take medicines that will work for one type of patient and test them for other conditions. Often that doesn't work, but in some cases it brings as much or greater value as the original therapeutic target. So when the pandemic hit in 2019, we reviewed our portfolio and took several drugs and began testing them to see whether they would assist society in dealing with the pandemic that we have and are facing. It is that work that's being acknowledged today, and we are honored to receive this Patient Impact Award. We admire the work that Cures Within Reach performs, and like other honorees today, are pleased to be recognized. Thank you again for recognizing Lilly with the 2021 Patient Impact Industry Award.
Thanks to Robert and the entire Lilly team. Lilly has been a leader in the industry about how existing therapies can be used to help patients in need, and we look forward to seeing what they'll be doing in the years to come. Finally, we have the Janet Davison Rowley Patient Impact Research Award.
Cures Within Reach presents the Janet Davison Rowley 2021 Patient Impact Research Award to Reframe, part of Caliber at Scripps Research. We honor the impact that this screening database is having on patients with neglected diseases, as well as finding potential COVID-19 treatments. We celebrate Caliber's commitment to this database's ease of accessibility and the collaboration made possible through this technology, especially during the ongoing pandemic. Since Reframe's launch, repurposed drugs such as clofazimine in cryptosporidiosis and Oranafin in tuberculosis are impacting patients in clinical trials. Congratulations to the entire Reframe, Caliber, and Scripps team.
Thank you very much to everyone at Cures Within Reach, all of Barbara and Claire and all of the people who've been involved in sponsoring the work. Very much appreciative of the opportunity to receive this award on behalf of many of my colleagues here at Caliber and Scripps Research Institute. We built the Reframe compound collection starting in 2015 and have initiated several clinical trials based on it in the hopes that we can include every small molecule drug that has been safely tested in humans to repurpose them appropriately. I think this is really valuable. I think based on what panelists and others have discussed today is really, it's critical for us to be able to include as many of these compounds. Nearly half of these compounds are in fact not available commercially, so we've actually been able to make them ourselves and include them in the collection. Obviously, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who sponsored this work, has been essential to making this happen. And obviously, with the speed of the pandemic and then also the ability to distribute this compound collection as early as January of 2020 to collaborators in Hong Kong, speak to the ability to be able to repurpose effectively and efficiently, and in cases where we can't, understand where we need to develop novel drug entities. So I'm really excited and appreciative of all of my coworkers and collaborators here at Scripps, all of the many groups who've screened the Reframe collection, including folks within the Cure Within Reach network, and looking forward to sharing the collection, sharing the data in real time, and bringing the best opportunities to patients.
Congratulations again to Eli Lilly and Company, to Cure ID from the FDA and NCATS at the NIH, as well as Reframe at Scripps Research. We're so thrilled to honor you this year. That brings us to the close of our event today. We want to thank again our industry partners for their ongoing support of our work and our mission to impact patients with unmet medical needs through repurposing. We also are very, very grateful to our philanthropic partners, especially within the diversity, equity, and inclusion space and our efforts there this year and moving forward, as well as all of our disease and patient group partners who have spread the word about this and all of our other events. We're very grateful to all of you for your support. Finally, I want to thank our amazing speakers who really provided such a rich and robust conversation about diversity, equity, inclusion from all stakeholders at the table. I want to thank you all so much for your participation. Thanks to all of you for attending today. We're very grateful for your time, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.